Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 91, Theresa Barrington. Acknowledgement to Don Bradmore, who wrote the story on Theresa Barrington for the Female Convict Research Centre Incorporated in 2021. The centre is an amazing source of female convict information, and they have given me permission to reference information to help create this episode. Theresa Charlotte Barrington was 19 years old and single when she arrived in Van Diemen's Land aboard the Emma Eugenia in March 1851. Theresa was prepared to take advantage of the freedoms that she'd not previously enjoyed and to hold her head high and embrace that all came her way. Theresa Charlotte Barrington was born at York in Yorkshire, England, to Richard Barrington, an artist and commercial traveller, and Eliza Lee in 1831. Theresa was in Scotland when on the 24th of April 1850 she faced the Court of Judiciary at Glasgow, charged with theft. After a short trial, she was found guilty in terms of her own confession. She had no previous convictions and was sentenced to transportation for 7 years. A newspaper report of the trial revealed that on the 30th of July on the previous year, she had opened safe lock places in a house in Glasgow and had stolen a large quantity of apparel and silver plates. Soon after the trial, Theresa was taken to Millbank Prison in London. Eventually, she was put aboard the Emma Eugenia, which sailed from London on the 30th of October 1850 and reached Hobart on the 7th of March 1851. While at sea, Theresa had suffered from hysteria and had been on the ship doctor's sick list for 10 days, but had recovered fully by the time of disembarkation at Hobart. Upon arrival, she was described as 5'1.5" tall with a fresh complexion, dark brown hair and light blue eyes. She could read and write, and she was Protestant, and she listed the trade of a nurse girl on her convict documents. Her conduct record appears to show that she was sent directly to the Brickfields hiring depot at North Hobart just a few days after her arrival in the colony, and she was assigned as a servant, first to Mr. William Brown of Barrack Street, then to the Wilson family of Liverpool Street, the Tonder family of Colville Street, the Lotter family at O'Brien's Bridge on the outskirts of Hobart, the Murphy family at Richmond, a short distance north of Hobart, and the Ibbotson family of Melville Street, Hobart. All of these assignments were brief. In the intervals between them, she was returned to Brickfields to await her next employment. This was a pattern that was to continue for a little over her first year in the colony. She was not charged with any offence by her employers at this time. Somewhere along the way, she met a young convict by the name of Joseph McCrow. He'd been in the colony since his arrival on the Nile on the 3rd of October 1850. 3 years earlier, at the age of 19, he'd been convicted at the Clerkenwell Quarter Sessions in London of stealing a handkerchief. Guilty of a similar offence previously, for which he'd been jailed for 4 months, he was dealt with harshly by being transported for a term of 10 years. There hasn't been a permission to marry record located. However, Joseph and Theresa were wed at St George's Church, Battery Point, Hobart, on the 17th of May 1852. Joseph was 22 and Theresa 19. Joseph's conduct record reveals that he'd been granted a ticket of leave a week after his arrival in the colony, and he was described as a shoemaker on the marriage certificate. After the marriage, the pair settled down together. They had relatively minor offences recorded against them in the next few years. On the 20th of July 1852, Theresa was found guilty of common assault, and she was ordered to the cells at the Cascades Female Factory for 7 days. Joseph was required to pay the court costs of the person that she had assaulted. Theresa gave birth to a daughter, Theresa Eliza, born at the Cascades on the 17th of February 1853, and she was baptised at the Cascades on the 4th of April 1853. On the 2nd of August 1853, Theresa was granted her ticket of leave. On the 2nd of August 1853, Theresa was granted her ticket of leave. She was then recommended for a conditional pardon, which occurred on the 29th of August 1853. In April 1854, Theresa gave birth to Edwin. He was baptised at the Holy Trinity Church in Hobart on the 5th of August 1854. In that same month, Joseph was charged with unlawful assault, and on that occasion, Theresa had to pay sureties for him to keep the peace. By early 1855, if not before, Theresa and Joseph had decided to go their separate ways. In April 1857, Theresa was declared free by servitude, and she left Van Diemen's Land soon afterwards and went to Victoria. In 1859, she gave birth to Edmund Petherick at Collingwood. The birth registration shows Theresa's surname as Theresa Charlotte Barrington and the father's name as Edmund Petherick. The birth certificate of the baby shows that Theresa and Edmund were married in Wellington, New Zealand in 1857, but there is no record of a marriage in New Zealand of an Edmund Petherick, nor is there any record of marriage between the pair in Victoria. It doesn't seem that this relationship had lasted long, as in 1861, Theresa gave birth to Emma Matthews at Sandridge, which is now known as Port Melbourne. This time the birth certificate states the father of John Matthews, but again who he was and what sort of relationship Theresa had with him is not known, and once more no marriage certificate could be located. However, on the 6th of March 1862, Theresa did remarry officially. Her new husband was Charles Rice, a London-born actor-comedian who was born in 1838, so he was 4 years younger than Theresa. Charles had sailed to Sydney in June 1856. The marriage ceremony took place at Christchurch in Castlemaine, a gold mining town in central Victoria. Inexplicably, the parish register shows Theresa had been a widow in 1855 and she used the surname Constantine. Where did that surname come from? As her first husband, Joseph McCrow, was still alive in Tasmania, he did not die until 1871, so she was certainly not a widow. Did she adopt the surname Constantine as an attempt to cover up that fact? Charles stated his occupation as a comedian and Theresa as a vocalist at the time of their marriage. Charles Rice was already a well-established entertainer by the time they married, at least in regional Victoria. There are advertisements for concerts which appeared in the Kyneton Observer in December 1862, and it lists his name high on the program as Charles Rice, the inimitable comic and characteristic singer, followed by the words the inimitable perfect cure, the sobriquet by which he was well known for his comedic performances. He's mentioned as performing on the 23rd of December 1862 at Wood End at the Mechanics Institute, and it says, concerts, amusements for the millions. Immense success of the new company, and his third on the bill, Mr. Charles Rice. It also mentions that he has a comic duet with Miss MacDonald, and that was at the Sampsons Victoria Hotel. In 1863, Theresa had another child, Charles Rice Jr., who was born at Collingwood. Theresa stated her correct name, Theresa Barrington, on this document. Charles did not survive infancy and died later in 1863. They are listed as Mr. and Mrs. Rice, comic vocalists, opening at the Great Britain in Ballarat in August 1863. In October 1863, they're mentioned at the Earl of Zetland Hotel, and it says, Grand Reopening Night. Mr. W. Brown begs respectfully to his friends and patrons of Ballarat the grand reopening of the Mammoth Music Hall with the following host of talent. Theresa is listed as second on the bill as the admired vocalist, and Charles Rice is fourth on the bill as the eccentric and only cure. In 1864, Theresa made her first public appearance as a vocalist and actress with her husband's troupe of performers. In late August, the Star in Ballarat carried announcements of the grand ball for the benefit of Mrs. Charles Rice to be held at the Great Britain Hotel on the 1st of September. In 1864, she gave birth to a daughter whom she named Lillian Annie Rice in Collingwood. Theresa stated her name as Theresa Charlotte Leslie on this document. On the 29th of July 1864, it mentions that Mr. and Mrs. Rice, vocalists, duettists, are open to engagement from the 6th of August at the City Hotel. By late 1864, Theresa was very much part of the performances, most of which her husband appears to have written as well as performed in and stage managed, and she, as one of the leading lights of the company, received enthusiastic reviews. On the 23rd of November 1864, at the Haymarket Music Hall, it says, attraction extraordinary, engagement of Crescent City minstrels, re-engagement of Mr. and Mrs. Charlie Rice, the above popular combination with the assistance of Mr. J.R. Vincent. On the 23rd of December 1864, the Mackay Times and Rodney Advertiser, a paper in Heathcote, Victoria, noted that at the local concert hall, Mr. and Mrs. Charles Rice continued to not only draw large houses, but by additional little novelties they amused their audience as much as on their first appearance here. So it mentions the Heathcote Concert Hall. Saturday night will be a grand night on which the occasion Mr. and Mrs. Charles Rice, the celebrated characteristic vocalists, will make their first appearance at Heathcote. And again, they're in Heathcote for an engagement on the 29th of December 1864. Mr. and Mrs. C. Rice, vocalists, open to engagement at Heathcote Hotel, Heathcote. Theresa's most successful year seems to have been 1865. She performed mainly in regional towns in Victoria, and Theresa and Charles won much acclaim as the well-known characteristic vocalists and duettists. There's another mention with them at Heathcote. The company succeeded in pleasing the audience to a late hour with well-executed novelties. The charade acting of Mr. and Mrs. Rice was a prominent feature in the entertainment and elicited loud applause from their discriminating audience. A newspaper review of their concert at the Heathcote Hall on the 29th of April said Mr. and Mrs. Charles Rice and members of their troupe kept a large audience well amused. The company played a very laughable little farce called The Irish Ghost with great spirit. The audience marked their appreciation of the acting by very marked demonstrations of applause. And on the 5th of May 1865, the same newspaper commented on another event held at the concert hall. The company gave a select entertainment consisting of a well-selected program of various kinds of vocal music, principally characteristic and comic. The repeated recalls and applause sufficiently testified to the fact that the audience were well pleased with the efforts of Mr. and Mrs. Charles Rice and others to amuse them. On the 12th of May 1865, again at the Heathcote Concert Hall, a sensational drama entitled The Sailor's Dream will be produced. The principal characters will be sustained by Mr. and Mrs. Charles Rice, Harry Cook and Mr. Dixon. The reception with which this favourite company met with on the occasion of their last entertainment warrants the belief that they will again draw a good house. In June 1865, the paper ran an advertisement for a dramatic entertainment to be held in the following month to raise funds for the local hospital. An editorial comment that accompanied the advertisement revealed that a strong cast, including Mrs. C. Rice, would present 2 farces, Hunting the Turtle and £5 reward. On the 23rd of June 1865, complimentary benefit to Mr. and Mrs. Charles Rice. On Wednesday evening, Mr. and Mrs. Charles Rice will appear before the public in a farewell entertainment for their benefit, when we will have no doubt a good house will assemble to witness the last performance of these favourites at Heathcote, at least for some time to come. They packed their bags and headed for Queensland. Advertisements for the concerts they gave in that colony throughout 1866, 1867 and 1869 appeared regularly in the newspapers, especially in regional towns of Rockhampton and Bowen. On the 29th of August 1868, it says, "The arrival of a theatrical company, Mr. and Mrs. Charles Rice, were warmly appreciated, as in the first place they are good in themselves, and in the second there has been such an utter dearth of anyone like public amusements, that performances far inferior to theirs would no doubt have gone down. Some of our amateur thespians assisted them in giving a benefit for the Kennedy Hospital at Bowen." So Theresa, now in her 30s, was coping with 5 children, travelling with Charles and his troupe, and their eldest child, Theresa Eliza McCrow, was about 11 when her baby sister, Lillian Annie, was born, and Edwin was about 9, Edmund Petherick about 4, and Emma 2 or 3. Did Theresa and Charles have the children with them? Well, it seems likely. There was a notice in the Northern Argus in Rockhampton on the 5th of December 1866, and it alerted readers to a temple of music which was to open that very night at the Cornstalk Hotel with the largest and most talented company ever to have appeared before the Rockhampton public. Listed on the program at the top of the bill was Mrs. Charles Rice, the charming soprano and danseuse, and in second place, Mr. Charles Rice, the inimitable comic. Interestingly, at the very bottom of the cast list was Master Barrington, the infant comedian. So, is Master Barrington Theresa's son? Was it Edwin? He would have been 9 years old, so hardly an infant. Or was it Edmund, who was about 4, which probably is more likely? On the 18th of April 1867, in the Rockhampton Bulletin and Central Queensland Advertiser, it mentions renewals of publican's licence, and it says Charles Rice, the Cornstalk. So he's appeared there in December 1866, and by April 1867 is the owner. And then there was a recollection article, and it says Cornstalk celebrities. Another of the old Cornstalk celebrities were Mr. and Mrs. Charles Rice. Mr. Rice was a wonderfully versatile comedian and singer, and his wife possessed a fine voice. By a peculiar inflection of the voice, she could blend some soprano and contralto notes, particularly tuneful to the listener. On the 24th of April 1867, the Cornstalk, in spite of a hitch or two, things which are unavoidable on the first night of a new play, Susan Hopley is the best thing we've seen at the Cornstalk. We do not speak of the drama itself, but of the general acting and the manner of which it was placed upon the stage. Although the characters are very numerous, there was an evenness and is dovetailing, if we may say so, in the action and in earnestness on the parts of the dramatic personae, which are so absolutely necessary to keep up scenic delusion and to secure the attention and sympathy of an audience. The vision scene was capitally managed, and the delusion perfect and duly appreciated. Susan Hopley is especially suited to Mrs. Rice. Her voice is more tuned for gentle pathos than for tragic declamation, and yet during the vision scene, and when the ghost of her brother appears to her in her dreams, the burst of passion which succeeded the former soft plaintiveness was well rendered and very effective. Mr. Rice, who cannot manage anyhow to act badly, looked and played Jeremy in good style. The house was crowded, there was not an inch of room to spare, and one night have heard a pin drop during the action of the play. On the 27th of July 1867, to hotel keepers and others, peremptory sale by auction under bill of sale by order of the mortgagees, furniture, bar fittings, painted stove, kitchen utensils of the Cornstalk Hotel, also a pianoforte, benches and all sceneries or decorations attached to the concert room. Instructions from the mortgagees to sell by auction. And on the 3rd of August 1867, evidently Rockhampton people wanted some appeal nearer home, for 7 days later they packed the Theatre Royal to give benefit to the old Cornstalk celebrities, Mr. and Mrs. Charles Rice, and the old reliable, the Lady of Lions. And in the same paper, to let the Cornstalk Hotel to a respectable tenant situated on a half-acre of ground, corner of Fitzroy and Bolsover Streets, with stabling, yard and concert room in good repair. On the 16th of September 1867, it says, I, Mary White, now residing at Rockhampton, do hereby give notice it's my intention to apply at the next petty sessions for a publican's licence for the sale of fermented and spirituous liquors in the house and appurtenances thereunto belonging situated at Rockhampton. The house contains 4 sitting rooms and 10 bedrooms, exclusive of those required for the family. The house has been licensed before to Charles Rice of the Cornstalk Hotel. I rent the house from Mr. Bryson, which I intend to keep as an inn or a public house. So by late 1868, the success that Charles, Theresa and their band of singers, actors and dancers had achieved in the previous 6 or 7 years may have stalled. 2 events in Rockhampton in early 1869 seem to have been the last appearances together of Theresa and Charles. There was the grand concert in late January, and a review of it in the Rockhampton Bulletin and Central Queensland Advertiser concluded that Mrs. Rice appeared with great success. And then the second in early February 1869 was a performance at the Theatre Royal of the play The Peep Showman, the cast of which included Charles playing the character of Cognivant Crowfoot and Theresa as Mary Mayland, a village milliner's apprentice. A notice in the Northern Argus prior to the performance had informed the public that this great drama was being produced for the benefit of Mr. Charles Rice, and it was currently playing with great success in London. And the mention of London in the Northern Argus notice is ironic because it's likely that this is exactly where Charles wanted to be. It seemed he'd reached a stage in his career by this time where he thought he would be successful in England and he could possibly profit from overseas experience. So it seems at this time that Theresa and Charles had separated, whether it was Charles's desire to go to England or some other reason, but during 1870 he sailed for England. Theresa gave birth to her 6th child, a daughter, Cora Esther on the 30th of November 1870, the birth notice was published in the Mackay Mercury and South Kennedy Advertiser, and it simply read, "At Mackay on the 30th of November, Mrs. Charles Rice, a daughter." So after Charles had gone, Theresa remained at Mackay for a short time. There was a classified ad in the Mackay Mercury and South Kennedy Advertiser on the 10th of June, and it says, "Mrs. Charles Rice begs to inform the inhabitants of Mackay that she is prepared to execute all kinds of ornamental painting on glass and wood on the shortest notice and most reasonable terms. Mrs. C. Rice, Mackay, June 10th, 1870. So it looks like Theresa was endeavouring to earn an independent income to support her and her children. Now, she may have heard at this time that the father of the first two children, Joseph McCrow, passed away in Tasmania in 1871. And then there's also a mention about Charles Rice. She already would have maybe heard by this time, in early April 1874, that Charles may not have been as successful as what he'd hoped, as there was a heading called London Gossip in the Rockhampton Bulletin, and it's published this: "The pantomimes are in full swing. Covent Garden is said to be a failure in regard to acting and scenery. The provincial manager, Mr. Charles Rice, has not been quite up to London expectation." So in 1875, no doubt a little dejected, Charles returns to Australia. There was an advertisement in the Bendigo Advertiser in Victoria in early February 1875, and it was announced that he had been engaged to appear in The Waterman at the Theatre Royal, adding it was his first appearance at Sandhurst for 10 years, and that he was being received with thunderous applause nightly. On the 26th of February, so a fortnight later, Theatre Royal, Market Square, Mr. Charles Rice, characteristic vocalist. In December 1875, it seems that he is in Hay, New South Wales, and it says that Kinque Flexel Company, this distinguished troupe, which for the last week have been performing at Masonic Hall to crowded houses, have certainly succeeded in establishing a claim upon public patronage. The varied nature of the entertainments is well sustained in the versatility of the artistes. Whether it be singing or low comedy, this company are first rate. On Boxing Night, the house was crowded to the very door by the highly appreciative audience. The versatility of Mr. Charles Rice was as well sustained as ever. In the 3 dramatic performances which were included in the bill, the parts were all exceedingly well sustained. The business-like acting of Mr. Charles Rice in Chili Chutney would have done credit to the Melbourne boards. We were, however, disappointed that he did not treat the audience to his inimitable rendering of The Thimble and the Pea. Also on the 18th of February 1863, Sidney James Hustler was born in Melbourne. He's labelled as illegitimate, and his father is listed as James Devereux Hustler, French polisher, aged 37, and mother Sidney Ellen Barr, born in Sydney and 21 years old. In 1896, Sidney James marries Jane Piper, and they had a daughter, Nettie Julie, who on her marriage certificate initially has her surname as Rice and then changes it to Hustler, and the same adjustment occurs with Sydney's name. In 1903-1904, he's living at Redfern, New South Wales, as a painter, and Sydney's death record is under the name Rice when he dies in Ryde in July 1939. The assumption is that Charles Rice rears Sydney from about 1876, when he separates from Theresa and meets Sidney Ellen Barr. Sidney Ellen Barr does marry James Hustler in 1871 in Victoria, but James dies only 3 years later, aged 45. So it seems that Charles has moved on and has a new lady, Sidney Ellen Barr. In Wagga on the 3rd of April 1876, grand dramatic musical and Terpsichorean entertainment, and it mentions Mr. Charles Rice as the inimitable comique. And it also mentions during the evening, Miss Ashley and Mr. Charles Rice will sing their popular duets, The Murrumbidgee Squatter, Colonial Experience, Little Farm, Mr. and Mrs. Dots, and ABC. Julia Ann Hope Rice is born on the 11th of April 1877 in Wagga. When Julie marries Frederick Harry Sargent in St Andrew's Cathedral, Sydney on the 2nd of June 1909, she lists Charles Raymond Rice as her father and says he's a painter. Julia and Frederick had 3 girls, and Julia died on the 13th of August 1971 in Mortdale, New South Wales. 3 other children were born to Charles Rice and Sydney Ellen Barr, who did not survive infancy. Mary Charlotte Rice, born on the 25th of August 1879, who died on the 8th of November 1879 in Alexandria, New South Wales, and twins Charles Rice, born on the 4th of March 1883 in Waterloo, New South Wales, who died on the 28th of May 1883, and Raymond Rice, who died on the 13th of March 1883. Interestingly, when Sydney Ellen Hustler died in 1894, Charles Rice was the informant and was living at the same address as her in Alexandria, New South Wales. Meanwhile, Theresa was getting on with her own life. In 1882, at the age of 52, as Theresa Charlotte Rice, she married a man by the name of William Marsden in Melbourne. William had been married prior, in Sydney, to Maria Harmer in 1867 when he was 48, and Maria had died on the 1st of September 1883 in West Melbourne. So he married Theresa little less than a year after the death of his previous wife. Unfortunately, the new marriage did not last long. Marsden passed away at West Melbourne in the following year. He'd been born in England in 1819 and he was 64 when he died. On his grave, his wife is listed as Theresa Charlotte Napier Marsden. And upon his death, it stated that they were living at 6 Victoria Street West in Melbourne. 6 months later, on the 14th of March 1884, it states Mrs. Marsden begs to intimate to the residents of West Melbourne and Hotham that she intends to carry on the business of a tobacconist, recently conducted by her late husband, and trusts that by selling the same quality of goods to meet a continuance of support. Victoria Street, West Melbourne. And a couple of months later, Mrs. Marsden, tobacconist of Victoria Street, West Melbourne, desires to intimate to the public we are lovers of the weed, and she has just received a fine stock of the best brands of American tobaccos and pipes of the newest description, which she is confident will meet with due appreciation from all who accord her patronage. A call is respectfully solicited. And on the 2nd of February 1885, between 3 and 4 o'clock on Sunday morning, Mrs. Theresa Marsden, the keeper of a small tobacconist shop situated at number 6 Victoria Street West, was awakened through hearing a crackling noise and looking through a window into the shop saw it was on fire. She raised an alarm and some of the neighbours with a few buckets of water extinguished the flames. The stock on the shelves at the back of the counter were burnt and appears that the flames started there. The whole stock was more or less damaged by water, but the injury was covered by insurance from the Royal Insurance Company. The origin of the fire cannot be accounted for. So after this occurred to her business, it seems that Theresa went to New South Wales to live, possibly to live with one of her daughters, and this is where Theresa's life appears to plummet out of control. On the 18th of August 1888, now 57, she's charged with several others in the police courts in Sydney with being drunk. The report in the Evening News gave her name as Theresa Barrington. In April 1893, she and a female acquaintance by the name of Maud Brennan, also known as Maud Carr, described as 2 wrong-uns, were found guilty of attempting to steal from the person of James Barry a silver watch and chain valued at £2. Both were sentenced to 6 months' imprisonment with hard labour, and in 1894, then 63, she's fined £1 and jailed for 4 days for being drunk and disorderly. Charles Rice dies on the 8th of October 1910 at his daughter Julia's residence at Kogarah in New South Wales, aged 72. His son-in-law is the informant and states that Charles has had 3 marriages. The first 2 weren't known to them, and the third was to Sydney Ellen Hustler, and his occupation at the time of his death was a painter. Theresa passed away at the home of one of her daughters in Melbourne on the 9th of September 1915 and was buried the following day at the Melbourne General Cemetery. Her death certificate shows the cause of death as senile decay, and she was 85 when she died. Her death record states Marsden, née Rice, on the 19th of September at her daughter's residence, 130 Dudley Street, West Melbourne, Theresa Charlotte Napier Marsden, and in brackets, Mrs. Charles Rice, vocalist, loving mother of Theresa, Mrs. Laymeyer, Frederick, and Cora, Mrs. Gorman, aged 85 years. So 3 children were mentioned in her death notice, As you would notice, though, not all of the children. So whether she kept in contact with those other children doesn't seem likely. So her life was a very long and colourful life. And I'm going to just fill you in on her family members in a bit more detail. So the first child of Theresa's that she had with Joseph McCrow was Theresa Elizabeth McCrow, and she was born on the 17th of February 1853 in Hobart. She married Alfred Crane, who was commonly known as Jeremiah, at Milchester, Queensland, on the 22nd of March 1874 when she was 21. She was listed as Theresa Constantine on her marriage certificate and lists her parents as unknown Constantine, a bootmaker, and Theresa Barrington. Jeremiah was a minor at the time of their marriage. Then in 1892, she married Leonard Frederick Lehmeyer. She lived in Northcote in 1919 and was a dressmaker. However, Leonard wasn't listed in that census with her. And she died on the 14th of June 1928 in Victoria, aged 75. Her death certificate stated her mother's surname was Barrington and her father, Constantine Joseph Marsden. And the second child, Edward McCrow, he was born on the 30th of April 1855 in Hobart, and in December 1909 he's recorded as sailing from Melbourne to Hobart. And then I'm unable to find any further information on Edwin. Her second partner, Edmund Petherick, he was born in 1836 in Wellington, New Zealand, and was a farmer, and it's said on the birth certificate that they married in Wellington, New Zealand in 1857. In 1936, there is a census record for an E.V. Petherick living in New Zealand, and Edmund, also known as Frederick Petherick Jr., was born in 1859 in Collingwood, Victoria. Another partner, John Matthews. Emma Matthews was born at Sandridge on the 15th of June 1861, and the information given was that John Matthews worked on the railways. He was a 29-year-old from England, and it stated they married on the 3rd of June 1860 in Melbourne. However, I'm unable to find anything on John Matthews. Then Charles Raymond Rice, who became her second husband. He was born in London. He was listed as a vocalist on Lillian's birth certificate and was aged 26 when Lillian was born, their second child. And Theresa is listed as being born in Edinburgh and was 30. The second, Lillian Annie Rice, was born in 1864 in Collingwood. Theresa was the informant on her daughter's birth and stated that Charles and her married in Castlemaine in 1861, not 1862 as the register says. Theresa also initially listed her name as Theresa Charlotte Barrington, but then she removed the Charlotte and the Barrington and then put in Rice, and then said formerly Leslie. That's another name that popped up that was not known before. Lillian married James O'Neill in Fitzroy in Victoria on the 19th of October 1882, and she died in 1928 at the Melbourne Benevolent Asylum, aged 64. Her death certificate stated she was a tailoress, and her parents were Charles Raymond Rice, comedian, and Theresa Charlotte Rice nee Barrington. On her gravestone, though, she listed her mother as Theresa Charlotte Napier Marsden. They had no children. Cora Etta Rice was their third-born child. She was born on the 30th of November 1870 in Mackay, Queensland. On her birth certificate, it states that Charles is listed as a comedian and states that him and Theresa were married in 1862 in Castlemaine. On the 31st of July 1885, so when she was 15, it says reported to police. Mrs. Marsden of 129 Victoria Parade, Collingwood, reports that her daughter, aged 16 years, left home on the 24th of July and has not been seen since. And that correlates to be around Cora's age. So Cora married Frederick McNulty under the name Cora Etta Marsden on the 11th of August 1887 in Fitzroy. Cora listed herself as a dressmaker and Frederick a painter. James Marsden, shopkeeper, was listed as Cora's father, and her mother listed as Mary Ann Marsden, nee Barrington. In 1888, Frederick is recorded as living at 46 Sutton Street, North Melbourne. She had 4 children after her marriage to Frederick McNulty. However, none of these children have Frederick McNulty as the father, so the assumption is that her and Frederick separated quite soon after their marriage. The first child, William Percy Devereux, was born 12th of June 1889 in Brunswick, Victoria. His father, though, is listed as William Devereux, a carter, born in 1867, and Cora was listed as Cora Etta Rice. It stated that Cora and William Devereux were married on the 11th of August 1887 in Fitzroy, which was the same date as the marriage with Frederick McNulty. William married May Amelia Dangerfield at the parsonage in Richmond on the 19th of September 1911 under the name William Percival Devereux. He enlisted in World War II as William Percival O'Neill and is under the same name in all census records and his death record. In the 1916 census, he's living at Newmarket and working as a straw hat blocker, and in 1917 listed as a munitions worker. In both census records, a William Percival Devereux O'Neill lived nearby, also a straw hat blocker. So it's sounding like that might have been William's son. William's listed as living at Brunswick North in 1924, Coburg in 1936, and then until the mid-1950s, and then in Pascoe Vale, working as a hatter. So May Dangerfield and William Devereux had 4 children, and William died on the 12th of June 1975, aged 86 in Pascoe Vale. There is another theory that Cora's sister Lillian married John O'Neill, same spelling, without the double L. So did Lillian and John actually rear William? And that is why there is a William Percival O'Neill listed in census records. Now, there's no father listed on the following births, and they're all registered under Cora's maiden name. Robert George Rice, born 1890 in North Carlton, father not listed and mother listed as Cora Etta Rice. Robert enlisted in World War I on the 10th of March 1915, initially in the 14th Battalion and then in the 2nd Field Battery, and stating his occupation was a driver. He initially listed his mother, Cora Gorman, residing at 171 Gladstone Street, South Melbourne, as his next of kin, and then the address was changed to Harris Street, South Melbourne in October 1915, then changed again to Gore Street, Fitzroy in December 1915, then Cornong Road, Carnegie, next to Tyre the Grocer in October 1916, and finally in Lismore, Dunorn Street, Murrumbina in March 1919. So they've had to change the next of kin contact details many times as Cora seems to be moving a lot. This was adjusted once he married in London, and then he listed his wife as Mrs. E.E.C. Rice of Caledonian Road, King's Cross, in July 1818. Robert fought in Gallipoli, Madras, Cairo, Tel Kabir and France, and he returned to Australia, leaving England on July 1919 and arrived with his wife and 2 children on the 23rd of August 1919. So Robert had married Ethel Evelyn Beryl Patchett at the Registry Office in Paddington, England on the 9th of May 1918. Ethel was 3 years older than Robert. She was 30 when they married, and Robert stated his father was Robert George Rice, deceased, on the marriage certificate. Robert seems to have remarried to Elsie Allen Dack at Mitcham, Surrey, England on the 5th of August 1922, and Robert died on the 5th of June 1967 at Lewisham, London, England, aged 77. And the children listed on his death certificate were Gladys Mabel Dack, Sydney Charles Dack, Sydney John Dack, and Beryl Eileen Rice. The next child listed was Ethel Bertha Rice, who was born in Port Melbourne in 1892, and Ethel died in 1893 in Port Melbourne. And the third child, Hilda, was born in 1894, again no father listed. So Frederick McNulty was also listed as marrying Elizabeth Jane Harden, known as Lizzie, in December 1894 in Fitzroy. So 6 years after there was a record of Frederick marrying Cora. They're recorded as having Frederick Joseph, born in Hotham East in 1900, who lived 5 days, Frederick Leo, born in 1906 in Hotham East, who died at the age of 23 in 1931 in East Melbourne. 11 children are listed, being born between 1894 and 1913. Frederick died in 1945, aged 67. So you would have noticed on Cora's son's military record that Cora's name was Gorman. Well, Cora married Patrick Gorman in 1898 in Victoria. Patrick's name was listed as Grummanley and Grummanley. They were said to have been married in February 1895 based on Eileen's birth certificate. Patrick Gorman had been born in South Melbourne in 1872, so he was 2 years younger than Cora. Cora is listed as Coretta on her husband's war records, and he enlisted in World War I on the 20th of January 1915. He was in the 21st Battalion and he was aged 43. His occupation at the time of enlistment was coal lumper, and as previously outlined, Cora moved a lot in this war period. In addition to the addresses on her son's war record, she's also listed as living at Coralie, Hadgett Street, Oakley. Patrick proceeded to Gallipoli on the HT Southland and arrived on the 29th of August 1915. And it said Patrick Gorman, born in Melbourne, did not arrive at the battlefield of Gallipoli. Along with many others, he drowned when the troop ship he was on, the Southland, was torpedoed in the Aegean Sea near Lemnos on the 2nd of September 1915 on its way to Gallipoli. Cora and John's children. Eileen was born under the name Irene on the 18th of March 1898 in South Melbourne, and she died on the 5th of January 1916 in Sydney. The next child, James Henry Gormanley, born in South Melbourne in December 1899, and he died on the 11th of March 1900, aged 4 months. Then Charles Patrick Gormanley, born in South Melbourne in 1900. He died on the 10th of October 1971 in Melbourne. The fourth child, Albert Edward Gorman, born on the 3rd of June 1904 in South Melbourne. He married Cecilia Richardson in Melbourne in 1932. They had a daughter, Alice Coretta Gorman, on the 30th of November 1932 in Melbourne. Albert enlisted in World War II in October 1939, and he served in Greece, Kantara, Egypt, and in the Northern Territory. He was discharged in August 1945, and Albert was living at Hornsby Heights, New South Wales, in June 1979. The fifth child, Henry Gormanley, was born and died in 1903 in South Melbourne. The sixth child, Theresa Caroline, was born on the 10th of July 1905 in South Melbourne. She married Kenneth Allen Rodwell in Victoria in 1945 and died in South Oakley on the 26th of September 2000. Kathleen Florence was born in 1906 in Melbourne. She married Victor George Rodwell in 1940 and died on the 25th of November 1979 in Fitzroy. And the eighth child, Frederick, was born on the 30th of June 1912 in Port Melbourne. He was living in Collingwood in 1939 and was listed as one of his brother Albert's next of kin in his war records. He married Millicent Jan Hook, and he died at Blair Athol, South Australia on the 17th of May 2002, aged 90. Cora then married Leslie Nesbitt Shanks on the 19th of April 1916 in Richmond, Victoria. They'd both had been widowed in 1915 and they had no children. Cora died in Oakley, Victoria on the 23rd of April 1924, aged 56, of pneumonia. Her father was listed as Unknown Rice, actor, and interestingly listed mother as unknown. So Theresa's daughter, Cora, was also a very interesting lady.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.